Anselm has given us his reasons for rejecting the argument for fatalism, the argument that human freedom is incompatible with God's foreknowledge. He uses the same analysis to reject an argument about the incompatibility between God's predestination of things and human freedom. He says, just as freedom is compatible with God's foreknowledge, freedom is fully compatible with God's predestination. There is no contradiction between the idea that God has predestined people to salvation and not, that God has predestined various events in the world, and that human beings act freely. Now, how does the argument go? It's really exactly the same analysis. So let's take a look at an argument analogous to that argument for fatalism that tries to argue for the incompatibility of predestination and freedom of the will. He says all you have to do is replace God's belief with God's decree. Instead of saying God believes that P, say God decrees that P. So here's the argument. Yesterday, God decreed that P, where P is again this true proposition about something you will do in the future. The past is now necessary, so it's now necessary that God decreed P yesterday. But then necessarily, if God decreed P, then P, after all, what God says goes. If God decrees something, it happens. So, well now, if A is now necessary, and necessarily if A then B is now necessary. That's that principle that we were worried about earlier. Well, we conclude from all of that that it is now necessary that P. And so that means it's impossible for me to do otherwise. But wait a minute, freedom requires that I have the ability to do otherwise. That's that principle of alternative possibilities again. So conclusion is I have no freedom. Well, the same argument then is really an argument that predestination is incompatible with human freedom. But Anselm says it fails for exactly the same reasons. First of all, God is outside of space and time. So God's decrees take place outside of space and time. God doesn't decree this yesterday or at some earlier point in that historical story. God decrees it outside space and time. What that means is that the idea that the past is now necessary is irrelevant to this argument. We would have to have an analogous principle that what happens outside of space and time is necessary, that God's decree is itself necessary, and that anything that God decrees is necessary from that vantage point. But why should we think that's true? Maybe it's true. Maybe what God decrees necessarily and with a deep metaphysical necessity that entails that it's necessary now, but it's not obvious that that's true. And in any case, the whole arrow of time historical necessity business from that point of view is completely irrelevant. So we would have to reformulate this argument fundamentally to try to overcome that problem. The second difficulty is the principle of alternative possibilities. We reject that for the same reason we did before. Human freedom is the ability to do the right thing for the right reason, roughly. It's a matter of not having the power to sin or not to sin, having alternative possibilities, being able to have done otherwise. All that's irrelevant. It's a matter of being able to preserve the rectitude of the will for its own sake. And so freedom does not require alternative possibilities. It doesn't require the ability to do otherwise. So even if it's true that everything that happens by necessity, that does not challenge human freedom. But Anselm also, remember, has rejected premise 5, that principle about the transfer of necessity. The idea being that if A is now necessary and A necessarily implies B, then B is now necessary. He says that doesn't work here any more than it did before. Because after all, we've got a mixture here of a funny historical after-the-fact, bobbing along with the arrow of time type necessity that is relative to the position of somebody on that timeline, and we're mixing it together with a sort of broader metaphysical necessity. And we're saying that they go together in this certain way. He says they don't do it. Whether something is necessary or not, in that historical sense, depends on my position in time. So depending on where I am, I might describe the same thing as either contingent or necessary, depending upon whether it's happening after me or before me or at the very same time. So he says, now I look at the past and it looks historically necessary. The present looks historically contingent to me now, but tomorrow it's going to look like it was necessary, and it will be necessary from the point of view of tomorrow, but that doesn't mean it's necessary now. Similarly, what's true in the past wasn't necessarily necessary then, even if it's necessary now. So he says all of that is irrelevant. That principle is false. It doesn't apply. And in this case in particular, the fact that God decreed this outside of time even, or at some earlier period of time, and that everything God decrees goes, does not mean that it's necessary now. It's something that might or might not be necessary. Maybe God decreed it yesterday, but that doesn't make it necessary. Even if God decreed it outside of time, does that give it a kind of metaphysical necessity? Maybe, maybe not. It depends on the nature of God's decrees. It would be odd to say that everything happens out of space and time, happens necessarily. God's eternal present, that spot outside of space and time, would have to be like an inverse Las Vegas. What happens in Vegas, they say, stays in Vegas. You'd have to say what happens in the eternal present becomes necessary not only there, but throughout all of space and time, at every present, everywhere along that moment of time. But why should we think that's true? That's to say God can't possibly decree anything contingent. But why should that be so? And anyway, why should we assume that everything that takes place along the path is itself something that God has decreed? Neither of those things follow. It might be that God decrees a few things, and that they really do have a kind of necessity at all points in time. But maybe God leaves other things open. Maybe God considers certain decrees contingent, and basically decrees that, hey, if such and such happens, then something else will happen. But the happening of that conditional decree, you might say, the fulfillment of the antecedent of that conditional if statement, maybe that's a contingent fact. Maybe God decrees that if Adam and Eve make the wrong choice, and here's what we're going to do. Okay? It's still contingent. It's still a matter of human freedom that Adam and Eve give in to temptation in the garden. But that doesn't mean that it becomes necessary because it's covered by one of God's decrees. It might be now necessary. Once they have freely chosen to sin, as a matter of contingent fact, now it becomes necessary that certain things are going to happen. But those things might not have been necessary beforehand. And so we have to think carefully about the nature of necessity, a time index notion of necessity, as well as some metaphysical necessity, the necessity of God's decrees outside of space and time, what the form of those decrees might be. All of those things are complicated. And Anselm is pointing out that, as it stands, this argument doesn't work. We would have to fill in additional premises about the nature of God's decrees, about the logical form of those decrees, about the extent of God's decrees, and then something about the relationship between God's eternal present outside of space and time and everything that happens in space and time, including every moment of time within that space, in order to draw any conclusions at all that would lead us to conclude something about the incompatibility of predestination and freedom. His conclusion is that we don't have to make a choice. We don't have to choose between freedom and grace. We don't have to choose between predestination and freedom. We can have it all.